Dead America, Kansas, Part 4, by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Day 0 plus 48. Atticus did some stretches in the middle of his office, bending deep like a yoga instructor that was trying to set a good example for the class. His back was tight and his eyes were tired from reading report after report for several hours without much of a break. As he was deep in a stretch, Evelyn knocked on the slightly cracked open door. She gingerly poked her head in, taking in his intense yoga pose. "How's it going in here?" she asked gently. "I'm not interrupting, am I?" He straightened his torso, but left his legs stretched out, letting his hamstrings feel the burn. "No, you're good," he assured her, just trying to stay limber. "You've been at it for hours," she said, shaking her head. "You should probably go for a walk or something, clear your head and get some fresh air." He pointed to the window, cracked open and sending a blast of cool air from the outside. "All the fresh air I need," he said. She cocked a brow. "And the walk?" she asked. "It's going to have to wait," he replied with a sigh. "Getting that bad in Kansas?" she asked. "Afraid so," he replied, bending once more to stretch his back. "How far along are you?" she asked, leaning on the doorframe. He straightened again, raising his arms high above his head. "About to start day 16, he said. "Wow, moving right along, aren't you?" she asked, shaking her head. "Anything interesting? I mean, that you're allowed to share with a civilian like me, that is." He chuckled. "I didn't sign an NDA." He said as he stretched to the left, reaching his arm towards the window. "Good to know," she replied. "Madison and her group have been pretty quiet for the last few days," Atticus explained. "Really just spending a lot of time getting Great Bend set up into something resembling a community. Turns out that's a lot easier to do when the place isn't completely overrun with zombies." Evelyn nodded slowly. "I'm sure it still has its challenges," she mused. "But yeah, not having to worry about flesh eaters around every corner sounds wonderful. Given their lack of weapons, it's a good thing they didn't have to deal with that," he added. "What about that captain?" She trailed off for a beat, looking at the ceiling and snapping her fingers. "Oh, what's his name?" "Bubba?" "Bennett," he corrected. "Yeah, that's the guy," she said, pointing at him. "What's he up to?" "Nothing good," he said, dropping his arms. "I don't want to upset you, so I won't go into details." She stared down her nose at him. "I'm a big girl." "Atticus," she said dryly. He sighed, finally relaxing his stance and looking back at her. "I know you are," he insisted. "But some of the stuff they've done, it's disturbing. Even to me, and believe me when I say that I've seen a lot more stuff than you have in your young life. I was already traumatized by the time you were learning to write your own name." She swallowed hard. "Okay, I trust you," she finally agreed. "But they are bad though, right?" "He's the reason I'm powering through the reading, so I can submit a report," he replied. "Based on what I saw with my own eyes, and reading what they've been doing over the last month, they're going to need to be dealt with sooner rather than later." She nodded. "Well, I'll let you get back to it then," she said. "I'll be back in an hour or so with something for you to nibble on. If you're anything like me, you're going to want snacks while going on a reading binge." "Sounds good, Evelyn," he said, offering her a warm smile. "Thank you." She nodded and shut the door quietly behind her. Atticus took his seat back at the computer, cracking his knuckles and clicking on the file titled Day 16. Burlington and the McPherson Escalation. He shook his head. Based on what he's done so far, I'm concerned what qualifies as an escalation, he thought, and opened the file. Chapter 2. Day 0 plus 16. Sergeant Cook sat in the cab of his truck, which sat at the side of a long stretch of empty highway at a crossroad. He was parked right beside a sign that read Burlington, 5 miles. He had been there for the last couple of hours, ever since the sun emerged from behind the horizon to start another day in the apocalypse. Normally, he would have gone with the men, setting up defenses in the last town they'd taken. But in this case, it was a small one-stoplight town called Gridley that was about a 15-minute drive to the southwest. When they first started rolling into towns and claiming them for their own, it was a mostly peaceful process. They'd show up with overwhelming force, firing a few warning shots towards the civilians, who would quickly lay down their arms. Every now and then, there would be a brave soul who would stand up to them, but some of the deserters would cut them down without hesitation. As much as that bothered Cook, he knew in those cases it was either the civilians or him and his comrades. Still, the sight of innocent blood being spilled in the name of whatever they were doing out there bothered him. People who didn't ask to be in this situation at all. Now, however, things had escalated, especially with Morgan, Rice, and Huff. Their caring for civilians had gone out the window with the last raid. One person with a gun on his hip had triggered them, and he hadn't even started to draw before the three of them opened fire, wiping out a small room filled with civilians. Cook knew that Bennett wasn't fully on board with it. However, the captain wasn't fully against it either. He didn't witness the incident, just heard the shots and came running. Cook replayed the scene vividly in his head, pleading his case that those three were becoming too wild and reckless, which only angered them. To keep the peace, Bennett had sent Cook out on his scouting mission. There wasn't much he could do at this point, however, as he already had so much blood on his hands by proxy that if he did desert the deserters and go back to the military, he would spend the rest of his days inside a jail cell, or worse. He let his mind wander, thinking about whatever massive assault the military was planning, and how people like him would be expendable. The thought of being forced to do the most dangerous work without adequate equipment kept him in line with Captain Bennett, not to mention the thoughts of them failing miserably with whatever battle they were staging for. After all, this was a group that thought it was wise to put an incompetent sociopath like General Rothman in charge of the Kansas City debacle, which cost God only knew how many lives, both military and innocent. Still, Cook wasn't pleased with his current situation, but he didn't see another path forward. He shook his head, trying to clear his mind and focus on the task at hand, which was to keep an eye out for trouble. Their next target was Burlington, which was just up the road. If they were going to be able to set up a permanent residence here in Kansas, this town was going to be key to that plan. It wasn't a huge town. However, it was situated right next to a major reservoir, which was going to be vital to their long-term success. Cook was forced to keep watch, because the civilians were very aware of the path of destruction Bennett and his crew were carving through the southern part of the state. With each town that fell under their control, their numbers grew. Cook didn't know exactly how many were in their ranks, but between sympathetic civilians who were rising up against their neighbors and the other deserters who joined their cause, they were easily within the hundreds. As he sat there, contemplating the situation and his fate, he spotted a reflection in the distance on the road, the light refracting off of the front bumper of a truck that was coming his way. "Looks like it's showtime," he murmured, and opened the driver's side door, grabbing his assault rifle as he stepped out. He checked the magazine, making sure it was filled to the brim, and it was. He grabbed his radio as he got situated behind the door and brought it up to his lips. "Contact at the Burlington mile marker," he reported. "Status," a voice came back right away. "Looks to be one vehicle. Unknown occupants," he replied. "Request backup." "Copy that," the voice said. Cook readied his rifle, aiming it downrange, and put his other hand up above his head and waving, in hopes that the truck would see him. Relief settled over him as the vehicle began to slow down. When the truck was on the other side of the intersection, it stopped. A man popped up in the back of the truck bed, aiming a hunting rifle over the top of the cab, and two other men got out. They were all middle-aged, wearing jeans and thick overshirts, all carrying heavy rifles. Only the one up top was aiming at him, though, so he aimed right back at him. "Okay, that's far enough," Cook warned as the two men began to move towards him. One of them stopped, raising his hand, stopping the other one. He raised his chin and stared at Cook. "Just came down here to give you some friendly advice," he said firmly. "Burlington is off limits to you and your friends." "Guessing you know who we are then," Cook said. The civilian sneered. "Oh yeah, we know all right," he said. "A quarter of our town is people who fled your slaughters over the last week." Cook shook his head. "Not sure what they've been telling you, but we're not out here slaughtering people," he insisted. "Oh no?" the civilian asked, eyes burning. "You sure about that?" "I got a couple of teenage orphans from Gridley that would claim otherwise." Cook hesitated, gritting his teeth. Yes, mistakes were made in Gridley. "Mistakes?" the man snapped, shaking his head. "Oh, did you hear that? Mistakes. Sorry, kids, your parents are dead because of a mistake," he sneered again, voice mocking. "Well, all is forgiven then." Cook sighed. "Wasn't me that did it," he said, but it sounded weak, even to his own ears. "You're with them, though, and that makes you just as guilty," the civilian declared. Cook wanted to argue, but he knew the man was right. If he didn't stop it, then he might as well have pulled the trigger. The end result would still have been the same. "Be that as it may," he said slowly. "I appreciate you coming down here to deliver your warning. Now let me deliver one of my own. We're coming to your town, whether you like it or not. And if you believe the worst of what's being said about us, then you should plan accordingly." The civilian wiggled his gun back and forth in the air. "Oh, believe me, mister." "We're planning accordingly," he drawled. Cook grunted in frustration. "Not exactly what I meant," he said. "I'm aware," the man snapped. "So what would you have us do? Just lay down and let you run over us?" Cook nodded. "Yeah, that's about the long and short of it," he said. "No man worth his salt is going to do that," he said, squaring up his shoulders. "We have pride. And if you don't listen to me, you're going to be buried in a shallow grave right alongside your pride," Cook shot back. The men shared a concerned glance, giving Cook a little hope that they might actually listen to him. "So, you expect us to be slaves like the others then?" the man demanded. "Let me ask you something," Cook said, keeping his voice level. "If we weren't here, what would you and your town be planning to do?" "Pardon?" the man asked, blinking in confusion. "What would you be planning to do?" Cook repeated. "I'm sure you have some food reserves built up, but going forward, you're going to need to grow food and tend to the livestock. Am I right?" The civilian scowled. "Yeah, you ain't wrong," he said. "That's all you'll be doing for us," Cook insisted. "Only thing that'll be different is that you'll be giving us a cut of what you grow. And with us, if you need something, we have the pull to make that happen." The men shared glances again, this time a lot more thoughtful, giving him hope. "It's a lot better than bloodshed," he continued. "You and your families can keep living, and you'll have armed security taking care of any zombie problem that pops up." The civilian pursed his lips for a moment. "Might be a tough sell with some of the boys back home," he admitted. "Then you'd better make a good sales pitch," Cook said firmly. "A lot of lives are depending on it, because believe me when I say, there are more of us than there are of you, and we're better armed and better trained. You'd be doing the right thing ending this peacefully before it even starts." The civilian nodded in agreement, putting Cook at ease. As he dropped his gun, it momentarily aimed in his direction, and a shot rang out from the side. A bullet ripped straight through the side of the man's head, dropping him to the ground. The sergeant let out a frustrated yell, looking up at the man in the back of the truck, who screamed and raised his gun to fire. "Shit," Cook cried, diving into the truck, the round ripping through the door right where he'd been standing. He stayed low as more gunshots continued outside. Several seconds later, Everything fell silent. Cook looked up over the dash, finding the two civilians on the street laying dead in pools of blood. The one who'd been in the back of the truck was on the ground on the opposite side from the attack, sitting up against the back wheel. The sergeant jumped out just in time for Morgan, Huff, and Rice to emerge from the small amount of underbrush at the side of the road, all grinning like idiots. "There he is," Morgan whooped. "Man, did we save your ass or what?" Cook snarled, staring him down, and once he was within striking distance, he threw a punch. Morgan narrowly avoided it, ducking back, and Cook darted forward to go after him. Huff and Rice leapt into the way, tearing him back. "Easy now, easy," Rice said. "Both of you calm down," Huff barked, throwing out an arm towards Morgan as he angrily tried to throw himself back into the fray. "We're on the same side." "You stupid motherfucker!" the sergeant screamed. "Fuck you, man," Morgan cried. "I saved your ass." "You murdered those people," Cook yelled back. Rice grabbed Morgan, and Huff moved right in front of Cook to try to calm him down. "Sergeant," he said, voice level. "Sergeant, I need you to calm down for a second. You're bleeding, and I need to check it out. Need to make sure it doesn't get infected. Not like we can just run you off to the hospital after all." Cook sobered a little, looking down to find that he was, in fact, bleeding from his leg. He stepped back and leaned against the vehicle so that Huff could pull back a torn piece of his pants, finding a small bit of metal from the door that had splintered off from the rifle shot. The sergeant winced a little as Huff pulled it out, but didn't break his death glare with Morgan. "Look, he's right. We saved you," Huff said as he stood back up. "No, you didn't," Cook snapped. "And what's worse is that not only did you not save me, you just condemned a lot of people to die. I had them ready to surrender. No fight, no bloodshed, just us going in and setting up shop. But now..." Huff rolled his eyes. "It's fine. We'll handle it," he said with a shrug. "And how many innocent people die as a result?" Cook snarled. Huff didn't have a response for that one, simply falling silent. In the resounding quiet, there was some faint talking coming from somewhere, and Cook's eyes widened when he realized where it was coming from. He and Huff raised their weapons, and the sergeant led the way around to the side of the truck, coming around to the other side. They found the last man on his last breath, talking into a walkie-talkie, presumably to someone back in town. Cook approached him, kneeling down and taking the device from his hands. The man let out a gurgle, eyes wide and terrified. "I'm sorry," the sergeant whispered, swallowing a lump in his throat. The man glared at him, apparently not impressed with the apology, until a few moments later, the light went out of his eyes. Cook got to his feet, anger shaking his limbs as he turned around. "You want to tell me again how you saved me?" he demanded. Huff didn't reply, simply staring down at the dead man, and before the sergeant could lay into him, the walkie-talkie crackled. "Benji! Benji!" someone yelled. "Are you there?" Cook stood there for a moment, staring at the radio in his hand, trying hard to come up with some kind of response. Finally, he brought it to his lips and hit the button. "I'm sorry," he said calmly, "but your friends are gone." "You son of a bitch. I'm gonna kill you," the man on the other end screamed. "Look, I understand your anger," Cook replied, keeping his voice as level as he could. "Believe me when I say that I share it. But now's not the time for anger. The next few minutes are going to be very important for you, so I want you to think before you respond. Can you do that for me?" There was no response, so he continued. "This can go one of two ways," the sergeant said. "You lay down your arms and we come in to set up shop. Or you try to fight, in which case a lot of people in your town are going to end up like Benji. It's your call." There was another long pause before the person came back. "I'm going to bury you in a shallow grave myself," he said, voice lethal. Cook nearly threw the walkie-talkie into the ground, but thought better of it He turned to the others, motioning for Huff to follow him. He brought the men together, complete with a still pissed-off Morgan, though he seemed reluctant, apparently a bit conflicted from whatever talk Rice had given him. "Rice, need recon on Burlington," Cook said, snapping into focus mode. "No engagement, and let us know if trouble is headed our way. Take my truck and haul ass." "You got it, Sarge," Rice said. "Huff, get Bennett on the line and get him down here with some force," Cook continued. "Tell him we have to move on Burlington now." Huff nodded and stepped away to talk into his radio. Morgan stepped up, his shoulders square, looking a lot more unrestrained by the lack of the other men around him. "Sergeant, we need to talk," he said. "Yes, we do," Cook said, keeping his voice firm even though he was exhausted. "I understand emotions are high after a firefight," Morgan said slowly, as if he were calculating his words. "But if you ever take a swing at me again, if I ever take a swing at you again, you'll be flat on your ass." Cook cut in, eyes hard. "Let's get something very straight, Private." He raised his chin. "We fucked up today, and because of it, we're going to face a lot of resistance. You're going to be with me on the assault, and if you fire without being fired upon first, or fire without someone with a much higher rank giving you the order to, I guarantee it'll be the last thing you ever do on this earth. Is that understood?" The private didn't look happy about it with his set jaw, but he nodded. "Yes, sir," he seethed. "Good," Cook said. "Now get the fuck away from me until it's time to go." Morgan stalked off to Huff, who was just turning back to address the sergeant. "Captain will be here in 5 with cavalry," Huff reported. "Good," Cook said. "While we wait, get that truck turned around so we can have some cover, in case those boys in Burlington want some revenge for their friends here." Huff smacked Morgan in the chest before walking away, and the private just stood there staring at the sergeant. Cook surveyed the dead men in the road, and he nodded to himself. "Private," he said, "while we wait, get these bodies off the road." Morgan glared at him with contempt, but Cook simply cocked a brow. "I'm not going to ask you again," he snapped. The private sighed and got started, and Cook watched him for a moment before turning to face up the road towards the battle that they now had to fight. This day just got a lot more difficult, he thought bitterly. Chapter 3. The trio of men stood behind the truck, keeping an eye on the horizon for trouble. They hadn't heard from Rice yet, so they were hoping that the people in Burlington were hunkering down rather than preparing for an assault. However, they knew that would cost them later. A few more moments of silence went by before vehicles came up the road from the direction of Gridley. It was clear that it was Captain Bennett and the reinforcements, by the way 4 vehicles screamed up the road headed straight for them. The lead vehicle slammed on its brakes close to them, and Cook motioned towards Burlington and started giving hand signals to form a barricade. The other 3 vehicles got into formation, several men jumping out and creating a firing line. Bennett jumped out of the lead vehicle, walking over to Cook and the others, who finally relaxed, now that their backup had arrived. "Sergeant, what the hell is going on down here?" Bennett demanded. Cook inclined his head towards the city. "Got paid a visit by some citizens of Burlington," he said flatly. "And?" the captain urged. Cook pointed over to the dead bodies on the side of the road, and Bennett sighed heavily, shaking his head. "I assumed that engagement was unavoidable," he asked, sounding exhausted. Morgan clenched his jaw, looking over at Cook with wide, fearful eyes. The sergeant wanted more than anything to throw the private under the bus, but he knew it would just cause more problems than it would be worth. "Unavoidable, Cap," he said, shaking his head. "They had me pinned down and were in a hostile position. Morgan, Rice, and Huff took them out from the flank before they could do real damage to me." He motioned to the flesh wound on his leg. Bennett surveyed him, not looking entirely convinced, but nodded along with the assessment anyway. "Okay then," he said. "So, what's the situation?" One of the hostiles got off a distress call to his people back in Burlington, Cook explained. I attempted to talk them down, but they weren't very receptive to what I had to say. So we got another fight on our hands, Bennett asked. And they know we're coming, the sergeant added. The captain grunted. Fantastic, he snapped. I sent Rice up to get eyes on the situation, Cook said. Haven't heard back from him yet, but there haven't been any gunshots, so at least we have that going for us. Bennett paced for a moment, thinking hard about the situation they were in. He seemed to agonize over every decision he ran through in his head, until he finally stopped pacing and let out a loud whistle, motioning for the others in the vehicles to emerge. A dozen heavily armed men, mostly soldiers with a few civilians scattered throughout, got out and walked over to him. They seemed like no-nonsense guys, armed with assault rifles, sidearms, knives, and a smattering of homemade explosives for good measure. They were battle-hardened, determined-looking, and not a group anyone would want to come up against under any circumstances. Huff and Morgan walked over as well, but Cook pointed to Morgan and motioned him back to the line to keep watch while they talked. The private didn't fight it, and for that the sergeant was glad. He'd done him a solid by not selling him out to the captain. Once everybody was assembled, Bennett raised his voice. Okay, guys, we're on the clock and time is not on our side, he bellowed. We have unknown hostiles in Burlington a few miles to the north of us. We have eyes on, so with any luck, we'll have an idea of what we're walking into by the time we get there. But here's what we know. He raised a hand. Their welcoming committee got vaporized, but not before they sent a warning flare-up. So we can expect at least semi-prepared resistance. The longer we wait, the more dug in they're going to be. So we need to hit them hard, hit them fast, and most importantly, hit them now. What's the play, Cap? Huff asked. I'll lead 2 teams straight up the highway, keeping their main force occupied, Bennett said. Eddie, take your team around to the east. Cook, take yours to the west. Punch through the lines, find whoever is in charge, and convince them to lay down their arms. And if they don't? Eddie asked. Bennett's eyes hardened. Be persuasive, he said firmly. Neutralize threats if you have to. But remember, we're setting up shop here. So unless you want to learn how to farm, take some care with what you do. The men nodded in agreement as Bennett looked around to the men, knowing that they were in for a fight and hoping he'd see everyone staring back at him by the time night fell. Move like we got a purpose, he said. And a chorus of yes, sir echoed as they broke, the groups heading back to their vehicles to gear up for battle. The captain pulled Cook aside by the arm. Sergeant, a moment, he said. Cook raised his eyebrows. What is it, Cap? He asked. Are you good? Bennett asked. Yeah, I'm fine, the sergeant replied, forcing himself to sound calm and level. The captain gave him a once-over, searching his eyes, clearly not buying what he was selling. If something's going on, I need to know about it, he said firmly. I know what went down in Gridley, and you have that same demeanor right now. Did things go down the way you said they did? Yep, they did, Cook replied smoothly. And you're right, I'm a little off. Just been a rough few days. Ready for the fighting to be over so we can get settled, that's all. Bennett stared at him for another moment, still not seeming to believe him. But he nodded and smacked him on the shoulder. Okay, if you need to talk, he said, I'm here. I appreciate that, Cap, Cook replied, forcing a smile. Now you good with running with just Morgan and Huff? Bennett asked. I'd like to keep Rice as a spotter. Yeah, we'll be fine, Sergeant assured him. Okay, let's get it done then, Bennett said, and extended a fist. Cook bumped it with his own before heading over to his team, who were waiting by the truck with some bullet holes in it. Huff was ready to go, but Morgan stood stiffly, brow furrowed. What was that all about? He asked. Just the captain wanting to make sure I'm good with only 3 men, Cook explained, not meeting his gaze. He wants Rice spotting. Morgan jutted out his chin. "You sure that's it?" he asked. Cook growled, glaring at him. "If I was going to throw you under the bus, I would have done it with you watching," he snapped. The private blinked at him in shock, but nodded in acceptance. Before he got into the vehicle, Cook held up a hand. "But keep in mind what I said earlier," he warned. "I may not have thrown you under the bus, but don't pretend for a second that you can run wild up there." He stared him down until Morgan withered and nodded, getting into the vehicle. "Okay, western flank is us. Hang on, because it's going to be a bumpy ride to get there." Cook started up the truck and immediately drove it off-road, getting it a good half-mile off the road before turning fully north towards Burlington. He knew it would be impossible to be concealed, given the flat land, but he wanted to minimize their exposure upon approach. Plus, he wanted to give the captain time to start his diversion. As they sped across the bumpy tundra, Cook gripped the steering wheel tightly, hoping and praying that the bloodshed to come would be minimal. Chapter 4. Cook parked the vehicle a half-mile outside of the outskirts of town, which was close enough to get a glimpse of the landscape, but far enough away to make it difficult for anyone standing guard to get a shot off in their direction. The trio got out and ducked behind the truck for cover, just in case. In the distance, they could hear gunshots beginning to crack, and they continued to intensify. Cook pulled out a set of binoculars, looking through it towards the outskirts of town. On the edge stood a neighborhood which emptied out onto a side road running along the outer rim of town. There were some makeshift barricades along the wall, but not much in terms of movement. He scanned carefully before spotting a couple of men with hunting rifles, standing guard behind a couple of cars strewn across the road leading into the neighborhood. They appeared to be on edge, scanning the horizon, but not locked onto their position yet. He kept watching, not seeing much of anything else in terms of armed men, but he knew they could still be there. "Okay, minimal resistance at 2 o'clock, he murmured. "Couple of guards that should easily be avoided." "Shouldn't we take them out?" Morgan asked. The sergeant shook his head. "No, we can avoid them," he said firmly. "But what if they follow us into town?" Morgan argued. "I'm with Morgan on this one," Huff added. "We don't want people on our flank." Cook growled. "Look, it's my call," he snapped. "We're going to avoid them. Listen to that gunfire. They're not itching for a fight. If they were, then they'd be running to the front lines. If they shoot at us, fire a couple back at them, and that should keep them at bay." The privates exchanged a concerned look, and Cook squared his shoulders. "You don't like the way I'm leading? Take it up with Bennett," he snapped. "Until he says otherwise, fall in line." They broke eye contact, both letting out a less than enthusiastic "yes, sir." "Okay, get in the truck. We're busting through that line," Cook said, and the men nodded. They got into the truck, the sergeant behind the wheel with Morgan riding shotgun and Huff in the back. Cook started it up and threw it into drive, slamming down on the gas and spinning out a bit as the tires gained traction. They screamed down the field, bumping around as Huff held onto the top of the truck to avoid flying out. When they were within a couple hundred yards of the edge of town, a few shots rang out in the distance. Nothing hit the truck, but they could hear the shots and see the muzzle flashes in the distance from the two guards. Huff squeezed off a few rounds in their direction, but it was more of a warning to them to back off than an actual threat. In any case, it did its job, because the return fire ceased. They made it to the edge of town, driving across the outer street and into a yard, completely avoiding a car blockade. They crashed through some barbed wire that had been put up as probably a minor deterrent to straggler zombies, the metal slapping against the sides of the truck. They got into the neighborhood, driving quickly, and the soldiers kept their heads on swivels, unsure of what to expect. A few shots fired from a house, one of which hit the side of the truck. Huff returned fire from the house he thought it came from, shattering a window. He wasn't sure if he hit the target, but the shots stopped coming their way. Cook sped down the residential road, headed towards the center of town. As they got closer, a car sped towards them, slamming on the brakes in the middle of the road to block their path. "Hang on!" the sergeant yelled and slammed on his brakes, turning the wheel sharply and causing the truck to skid around, coming to a stop horizontally across the street, about 40 yards from the makeshift barricade. Huff dropped to the bed of the truck, poking his head out over the side and aiming his rifle down the street. He spotted 3 men getting out of the car, taking up position behind it. He fired a few times as they moved, but all he did was shatter some windows. It didn't take long for the civilians to return fire, peppering the truck with bullets. One came so close to hitting Huff that he abandoned his position inside the truck bed, quickly leaping over the side. He hit the ground hard, and Morgan pulled him behind the wheel well for cover. "Now what?" Huff asked. Cook peeked up over the hood of the truck, getting a lay of the land. There were buildings on either side of them, businesses leading towards the center of town. He didn't see anybody in them, only the men at the end of the next block. An idea flourished in his mind, and though he wasn't thrilled with it, he had to do something. "Cover me," he cried, and the soldiers nodded, popping up and filling the air with hot lead. As they fired, Cook sprinted from cover, tearing over towards a small restaurant parallel to them. The door was unlocked, but with his momentum, he nearly ripped it off its hinges. A few civilians sat at tables inside, eating, all frozen in place as they stared in fear at the soldier that busted inside. "I'm not here to hurt anybody," he declared, "but I will if I have to. Just stay seated and I'll be on my way." The people nodded, none of them looking like they were at all ready to fight. Cook made his way to the back, stepping into the kitchen, and a man flew in his direction with a meat cleaver. He swung it violently downwards, narrowly missing Cook as he took half a step back. The metal slammed into the stainless steel counter, causing a few sparks to fly up. Cook planted his foot, shoving off of it and forcing his entire weight onto the man, which put him off balance. The sergeant shoved the man back into the counter, the impact causing the cleaver to clatter to the floor. Cook used the butt of his rifle to crack the man in the face, shattering his nose and sending blood splattering everywhere. He let out a groan and slid to the floor, curled up in pain. "Just stay down," the sergeant warned. "I'm not here to hurt you." "Your friend's shooting seems to indicate otherwise," the man sputtered through the blood water falling down his face. "I'm trying to put an end to it," Cook replied. "You know where I can find the person in charge?" "I just cook food, man," the man moaned. "But even if I did know, I wouldn't tell you." The sergeant shrugged. "Your prerogative," he said. "Now, are you going to stay down or do I need to put a round in your kneecap?" The man swallowed hard and reached up to grab a rag from the shelf next to him to contain the blood spewing from his face. "Just get out of here," he said, muffled behind the cloth. Cook nodded and headed to the back door, quickly exiting the building and slamming the door behind him. The gunfire coming from the front continued to intensify, and he rushed to the end of the row of buildings. Cook poked his head out, looking towards the intersection, spotting the 3 men behind the car. Their focus was still on Huff and Morgan down the street. The sergeant came out from hiding, parallel with the 3 men on the road before moving up. He kept his rifle aimed straight at them, finger on the trigger, ready to throw down at a moment's notice. When he got within 20 yards of them, a distance that made it an incredibly easy shot for him, he aimed just to the side of the closest man and squeezed the trigger. The impact startled the man, causing him to look over towards Cook, who had the drop on him. The civilian's eyes widened, face going pale, and he wasn't sure what to do. His 2 friends noticed he'd stopped shooting and turned around too, seemingly unsure of what to do. "Just put your guns down and you'll be spared," Cook said. A few more shots came from Huff and Morgan, causing the men to duck down, but they still didn't aim at Cook. In response, the sergeant used his non-trigger hand to hit his communicator. "Cease fire, cease fire," he said. "I got him." No more shots went off, and Cook stared the three of them down. "Just put the guns down slowly," he said. "I'm not here to hurt you." They contemplated for a moment, before nodding and slowly lowering their weapons before raising their hands. Huff and Morgan approached, guns at the ready. The latter walked up to the lead man, throwing a forearm into his face, sending him tumbling to the ground. One of the others started to step up towards him, but Huff stepped forward, aiming hard, snapping at the man to get his attention and stopping him in his tracks. Cook moved up, getting into Morgan's face. "Secure their weapons," he snapped, voice full of authority, "and don't lay another finger on them." "They were just trying to kill us 30 seconds ago," Morgan argued. "Now you want us to play nice with them?" "I don't know about you, but I don't like being shot at," Cook snapped. "If we can end this without more bloodshed on either side, that's what we're going to do. Now get their weapons." "That's an order." The private gritted his teeth, letting out a perturbed "yes, sir," before doing as ordered. Cook knelt down beside the man who'd been punched to the ground as gunfire echoed from all directions around the edge of town. "You hear that sound?" he asked. "That's people dying. Yours and ours. But let's be real. It's mostly yours. Do you want to put an end to it?" The man stared at him with contempt, but nodded jerkily. "Good," Cook said. "I just need to know where the person in charge is. One quick chat and all this ends. Do you know where they are?" "His name is Rich," the man said. "I can take you to him." "Smart man," Cook replied, holding out his hand. "Come on. Time is of the essence." The man took his hand and got up. Cook glanced at his men. "You two stay here. Keep the peace," he said, and with an extra glare at Morgan added, "And if something happens to either of these two men, I'm going to do the exact same thing to you when I get back. You understand?" Morgan sneered. "Well, I won't do anything to them," he drawled, clearly unaffected by what he believed to be an empty threat. "But I can't be held responsible if one of their own does something while trying to get to us." Cook stepped up, nose to nose with him, utterly fed up with his bullshit. "Then you better protect them with your life," he snarled, voice menacing, and Morgan gave a slight nod to end the conversation. The sergeant turned around and took the injured man's arm, quickly leading him down the street. "Appreciate you protecting my people," the man said quietly. Cook shook his head. "I'm not here for bloodshed," he explained. "But do yourself a favor and don't take that as an invitation to try something with me." "Don't worry, I'm on my best behavior," the man assured him. "What's your name?" Cook asked. "Barry," the man replied. "I'm Sergeant Cook," he responded, and picked up the pace to a jog as the gunfire continued to echo throughout the town. It took several minutes, but finally they reached City Hall, where two armed guards outside raised their weapons at the sight of Cook and Barry coming around the corner. Barry quickly stepped in front of the sergeant, holding his hands out. "Guys, relax. Where's Rich?" he asked. One of the guards glared at him in contempt. "Are you one of them now?" he demanded. "Where's Rich?" Barry cried. "I'm trying to end this." The two guards stayed stock still, aiming at them. But a moment later, a middle-aged man with graying hair exited the building. "Barry, what's going on?" he asked. "Sergeant Cook here will explain," Barry replied, stepping aside to reveal the soldier behind him. "You mind having your boss lower their weapons first?" Cook asked, not a fan of negotiating under duress. Rich crossed his arms. "Wasn't aware we were negotiating," he said flatly. Cook pointed upwards, highlighting the gunfire. "If you want that to stop, then we're negotiating," he said. The older man reluctantly nodded, raising his hands, and the guards lowered their weapons. "What do you want?" he asked. "We want to set up shop in this town," Cook said. Rich scoffed. "What does that even mean?" he asked. "It means we want to use this as a base, come and go as we please, and use the resources here," the sergeant explained. At our expense, Rich demanded. Cook shook his head. Think of it as an old-school mob arrangement, he said. You get to live and do as you please. You just slip us some protection money on the side. In this case, however, the money is actually food and water. The older man scowled. So we do all the work and you reap all the benefits, he asked. Pretty much, Cook admitted. Rich glared at him, not even angrily, but more in a disappointed way. Trust me, I get it, the sergeant said with a sigh. If you truly got it, then you wouldn't be standing here right now demanding our subservience to you, the older man said. If I wasn't standing here right now, Barry here would have been killed by one of my men, who would now be laying siege to your town hall. Cook argued, I'm not blind to the sins I've committed, but I know the only way to atone for them is to keep committing them so that I can prevent worse sins from being committed by others. Rich stared down his nose for a moment before taking a deep breath. Even though I might come to regret it, I find myself believing that statement, he admitted. Well, maybe not believing it, but definitely believing that you believe it. What do you want me to do? Call your people and tell them to put down your arms, Cook replied. Rich opened his mouth, but the sergeant held up a hand and motioned to his communicator. And I'll do the same, he said. Then what? Rich asked. Then my commanding officer will come into town and tell you what's going to happen, Cook said, and waited for a moment while the older man mulled it over. I promise you that this is the best deal you're going to get today. And every second you waste thinking about it is another second where bullets are flying. Rich nodded, pulling out his walkie-talkie. Everybody cease fire, he said firmly, tone urgent and authoritative. Repeat, cease fire. Lay down your arms, raise your hands, and back away from them slowly, and nobody else will be hurt. A few seconds went by, and the gunfire in the distance slowed. Cook hit his communicator. Captain Bennett, this is Sergeant Cook, he said firmly. They've surrendered. Cease fire. I repeat, cease fire. After a few moments, the thundering noise in the distance subsided. Good job, Sergeant, Bennett came back. What's your 20? Town Hall, Cook replied. Stay put. We're on the way to you, the captain said. Cook nodded and shrugged, looking up to the older man. What do you say we go get comfortable in your office? He asked. Rich shrugged, shoulders defeated. It's your town, he said. They went inside, and the sergeant breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that a lot of lives had just been saved. He felt guilty knowing that their quality of life would be going down, but at least they were alive. Chapter 5. Cook and Rich sat at a mid-sized conference table. There were a few bottles of water on the table, and Cook began to reach for one, but paused. Is it all right if I grab one of these? He asked. Rich furrowed his brow, shaking his head slowly. You conquer our town. But you ask for permission for a bottle of water, he asked. You seem conflicted, Sergeant. Cook sighed. Life would be a lot easier if the world was black and white, he said. Unfortunately, it's just one big blob of gray. Just trying to work my way through it while keeping as much of myself as possible. Hence, the politeness. The older man nodded and motioned towards the water bottle. For what it's worth, I was a school counselor for many years, he said. If you ever need to unburden yourself. Appreciate the offer. Cook replied as he unscrewed the cap. Not sure that would look too good on my part, though. Rich shrugged. Standing offer, he said simply. Cook nodded, and there was a knock at the door before Bennett opened it and stepped inside. The sergeant began to get up, but Bennett motioned for him to stay sitting. Gentlemen, I apologize for the delay, he said, spreading his arms. I'm Captain Bennett, and you must be the leader of this fine community. Name's Rich, the older man said. Please take a seat. Have some water. Bennett nodded and sat down next to Cook, grabbing a bottle and chugging half of it in a single gulp. All good in here. he asked after he swallowed. Cook nodded. I believe so, he said. Great. Let's get started, the captain said, setting the bottle down. Rich raised a palm. Before we go on, I have a question, he said. Bennett motioned to him. By all means, he said. How many of my people are dead? The older man asked, crossing his arms. As far as I know, only a couple, the captain replied. Few more took bullets, but my men are tending to them as we speak. Rich nodded. Thank you, he said. Bennett took a deep breath. I sense that tone in your voice, he said gently. You see us as some sort of conqueror here to rule over you like lords. Couldn't be further from the truth. So your sergeant has been telling me, Rich said dryly. Forgive me if I have my doubts. Have all the doubts you want, Bennett replied smoothly. But here's what's going to happen. We're going to have a contingent of men permanently stationed here. They're going to liaison with you, tell you what they need, be it food, water, or whatever the case may be. And it'll be up to you to delegate to your people to get it done in a timely manner. That's your responsibility. Rich cocked a brow. And your responsibility, he asked. I mean, I assume there's some sort of symbiotic relationship here. My men will make sure nothing bothers you, be it living or undead, Bennett explained. They will also stay out of your day-to-day lives, as much as realistically possible, that is. We'll coordinate with you, figure out the best living arrangement, and life will be mostly normal. The older man shot him a level stare. Mostly normal, he asked. Undead cannibals are roaming the earth. I think mostly normal is as good as it gets. Wouldn't you agree? Bennett asked, lifting the bottle to his lips again. Fair enough, Rich said. The captain took another sip. Then his tone went from friendly and gentle to lethal. But let me be very, very clear, he said. My men are untouchable, and any force will be met with an overwhelming response. If someone punches one of my men, a leg will be broken. If an attempt is made on one of their lives, there will be very public consequences. And if the life of one of my men is taken, well, let's just say shortly after that happens, my men and I will be the only people living in this town. Do you understand? Rich didn't seem afraid, just gave a calm nod. Very much so, he said. Good, Bennett said, downing the rest of the water before his friendly tone returned. Glad you're a reasonable man. If the rest of your citizens are as reasonable as you, we all might just come out the other side of this unscathed. He got up and tossed the empty bottle into a nearby trash can, grabbing another full one on his way to the door. Sergeant, a word, he asked. Cook got up, nodding to Rich, who caught his eye. Offer stands, the older man said. Appreciate it, the sergeant replied. Just keep your head down and do what they say. You'll get through this. Rich nodded in appreciation before motioning to the last bottle of water on the table, and Cook chuckled before taking it and shoving it in his pocket. When he reached the hallway and closed the door behind him, he turned towards Bennett. Captain, he said. Sergeant, Bennett replied. Looks like you were getting along with Rich there. Cook shrugged. What can I say, Cap? He asked. I'm a people person. Exactly why I want you to lead up the team that's here, Bennett said. The sergeant's brow furrowed in confusion. Cap, he asked, shaking his head. I thought I was your second in command. You are, which is why I'm putting you here, Bennett replied. Keeping that water supply flowing is vital if we're going to survive long term, and I trust you to do it. Bennett began to walk away, but Cook caught up to him, taking his arm. What's this about? He demanded. And don't give me this bullshit about keeping the water flowing. There's 100 guys in our group you could assign to that. Okay, Sergeant. You got me, Bennett said with a sigh. This was an assignment for you to save face. But the reality is, you're losing the faith in some of the men. Cook gritted his teeth. Morgan, he said. And Rice. And Huff, Bennett added. I talked to Rice and he told me how you went off the handle on Morgan. Cook squared his shoulders. Yeah, I did, he admitted. He murdered people and put us in danger and was gloating about it. Not the way they told it, the captain warned. In fact, not the way you told it. Cook glowered, realizing his mistake. I was trying not to throw him under the bus, he muttered. And in doing so, you lied to me, Bennett said. Not a fan of a second-in-command who can't be honest with me. So you're going to take this position in town, and we're going to keep it as me trusting you, because I don't think you'd like the alternative course of action. The sergeant knew he was burned, but he also knew he could do some good in the town. He took a deep breath and looked the captain in the eyes, nodding. Good, Bennett said. You'll have your pick of the men. Get them together and we'll have a briefing in a few hours before the rest of us ship out. Yes, sir, Cook replied. The two of them exited the building, but before they could get too far, they spotted one of their soldiers riding a motorcycle up to them. He stopped a few yards away, jumping off and rushing forward. Captain, he huffed. Sergeant. What you got, soldier? Bennett asked. General Rothman, the soldier said breathlessly. I found him, and we can get him. The duo exchanged a look that contained all the glee and vengeance they'd kept bottled up. You try to keep me from this, I swear to God I'll go AWOL, Cook said, bold and determined. Well, double AWOL. Shit. You know what I mean? Yep. You were at ground zero with us, Bennett replied immediately. You're in, but the assignment stands. Cook nodded firmly. Fair enough, he agreed. Bennett looked at the area in front of Town Hall, spotting a small coffee shop in the corner. He clicked on a communicator. Strike Team Alpha, coffee shop outside of Town Hall. 5 minutes, he instructed. We have a lead on the target. Repeat, we have a lead on the target. He glanced over at the messenger soldier. Where is he? A little town about 2 hours away called McPherson, the soldier replied. I'll check with Rich, see if anybody knows the town, Cook said. Do it, Bennett agreed. The sergeant turned on his heel and walked back to Town Hall. There would be rocky times ahead, but for the moment, none of that mattered. They had a chance to get the man that set them on this path. And for now, that was the only thing he cared about. Chapter 6. Cook walked back towards the coffee shop with a local middle-aged man named Josiah. Before going inside, the sergeant stopped and turned to him. Look, let me give you some free, unsolicited advice, he said gently. I know this is a difficult situation with us being here and essentially taking over your town, but we need your expertise. And after this is all said and done, Captain Bennett is putting me in charge of things here. I will consider it a personal favor if you'll just answer our questions. Not sure having a personal favor from a conqueror is that valuable, Josiah muttered. Look, I'm from these parts, Cook said. The other man blinked in surprise. Where? He asked. Lawrence, the sergeant replied. And you're okay with this being done to your people? Josiah asked. Honestly, no, Cook admitted. It keeps me up at night, and I work every day to prevent as many bad things as I can from happening. The other man sneered. I'm sure, he said. Look, I don't care if you believe me or not. It's the truth, Cook said with a sigh. And if you just answer these questions, it'll help give me leverage to make things as tolerable as they can be around here. Josiah hesitated, looking him up and down, before finally nodding and extending his hand. All a man has in this life is his word, he said as they shook. And I'm taking you at yours. Thank you, Cook replied with a nod. Come on. They walked into the coffee shop, where a dozen men lingered about, including Bennett, Morgan, and the 2 corporals. Good, you're here, Bennett said, turning towards the door. Who's your friend? Name's Josiah, sir, the man replied. Please, call me Bennett, the captain said with a smile. And welcome. Get some coffee or water." Josiah shook his head gently. "No, I'm all right," he said. "What can I help you boys with?" Bennett nodded and straightened. "What do you know about McPherson?" he asked. "Grew up there," Josiah replied. "Spent the first 25 years of my life there." Morgan sneered. He asked about the town. "Not your sad little life," he said. "Shut the fuck up," Cook snapped. "That's an order." The private gaped at him in shock, clearly offended. But the sergeant stared him down until he huffed and stepped back, crossing his arms. Cook gave Josiah a nod to continue. "It's not much of a town," the man said, ignoring the outburst and resounding tension. 10, maybe 12,000 people at its peak. The downtown area is nearly in the center of town, with warehouse and small factory space to the west, and the rest of the area to the east taken up by residential housing. "Thank you for giving us the landscape," Bennett said, "but we need your help in locating someone there." Josiah shook his head in confusion. "Afraid I haven't been back there in a decade or so, sir." He cut himself off. "I mean Bennett." "That's okay. We just need your best guess," the captain said, holding up a hand. The other man shrugged. "Well, I'll help if I can," he said. "What are you looking for?" Bennett motioned to the scout who had approached them from the motorcycle. "Tell him what you told me," he said. "This is what I know," the soldier said, stepping forward. "General Rothman is coming to McPherson to personally oversee the transport of a couple hundred men who are in captivity to the front lines. Now, these are trained men, dangerous men. They're keeping them locked up for a reason. But we don't know where." Bennett nodded, turning back to Josiah. "Which is why we need your knowledge of the town," he explained. "We can't get anybody inside to scout it out without risking detection. So if we're going to get our man, we're only going to have one shot at it. We need your best guess as to where in town they would be able to house that many people in a controlled way." Josiah swallowed hard. "You want me to help you kill a man?" he asked. "Yes," Bennett replied firmly. "But I can assure you that he's a man who deserves to be killed. His decisions and actions have led to the deaths of civilians." Josiah stared at him. "From what I understand, so have your decisions and actions," he said dryly. Bennett cracked a smile, clearly impressed by the other man's fortitude. "You're absolutely right," he said, giving a nod of agreement. "We have killed civilians, but they were a tiny fraction of the number of innocent deaths that are on General Rothman's head. In fact, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing if it wasn't for him and his reckless decisions. During our last encounter with him, he ordered us to open fire on unarmed civilians. We said no, and were exiled as a result. Now that's not to excuse anything we've done since then, but the fact remains. This man needs to die, and we need your help to do it, because the longer he lives, the longer more innocent lives will be put into peril." Josiah took a deep breath, taking a few moments before nodding. "Okay, well, right off the bat, I can tell you that there isn't a prison in town," he said. "I mean, there's a town jail by the courthouse, but that's little more than a drunk tank and a couple of cells for the good old boys who get a little too rowdy at the bar." "Is there any place downtown where this might be viable?" Bennett asked. Josiah thought for a moment, shaking his head. "I don't believe so," he said slowly. "It's all businesses and some office buildings." "What about hotels?" Cook piped up. Josiah tilted his head back and forth. "Don't really get a lot of visitors to McPherson," he said. "There are a couple of small places on the west side." But he trailed off, clearly having a thought occur to him. "What is it?" Ben asked. "Last year, they put in one of those fancy mid-rise hotels on the east side of town," Josiah said. "My buddy's daughter got a job out there and was telling us all about it. Like 300 rooms or something crazy like that. We spent a good couple of hours laughing our asses off at whoever thought they were going to fill that place up." "That could be the place," Bennett said. Cook shook his head. "I don't think so, Cap," he said. The captain cocked his head. "Okay," he said slowly. "Why?" "New hotels need key cards for the locks," Cook explained. "Power's been out for weeks now, so unless we see generator power, it can't be there." "Those locks are battery-powered and would be good for months," Morgan scoffed. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, the locks are battery-powered," Cook said, warning in his voice. "But the machine that programs the key cards requires electricity to work. So unless they have a generator to keep that machine running, it's not there." Morgan glared at him before shaking his head and leaning against the wall. Quiet again. "How far to the edge of town is it?" Bennett asked. "Right on the edge, just off the highway," Josiah replied. "It's literally the first building you see." The captain nodded. "Okay, so we check it out from a distance," he said. "If the lights are on, we go knocking. But if they're off, where else could they be?" "Warehouses and factories," Cook suggested. Josiah shook his head. "A lot of those places have been shuttered for years," he replied. "They're big, open, and empty." The sergeant snapped his fingers. "Schools?" he asked, eyes lighting up with the idea. Josiah nodded slowly. "The high school is one of the biggest in the area," he said. "Not just for the town, but a lot of the surrounding farmland as well." "How big?" Bennett asked. 3 stories, big courtyard in the center. Gym off to the side," Josiah said. "Probably 100 classrooms." Cook glanced at the captain. "That's gotta be it," he said. "Okay, where is the high school?" Bennett asked. "Northeast side of town," Josiah replied. "There is a small batch of houses to the north, but virtually nothing to the east." Bennett and Cook locked eyes, nodding at each other in agreement. This was definitely their best bet if the hotel didn't pan out. The captain stood up and extended his hand. "Thank you, Josiah," he said. "I trust you know how to find your way home." "I do," the other man replied, shaking his hand. "Go spend your evening with your family and enjoy it," Bennett said. Josiah nodded and glanced over at Cook, and they exchanged a nod, the sergeant mouthing thank you to him before the man walked out the door. "Okay, do what you need to do," Bennett barked as soon as the door shut. "We ride in 5. Chapter 7. The sun had vanished below the horizon as the group of 12 warriors pulled off the highway, just over a mile from the city. They had 3 vehicles and were armed to the teeth. Bennett, sitting in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle with Cook driving, got out, walking a few steps away from the vehicle. He pulled out a set of binoculars, peering through them towards the edge of town. It took them a few seconds before he spotted the mid-rise hotel that Josiah had told them about. He remained focused on it, looking for any signs of movement or light. After several moments, he spotted a couple of people on the roof with long guns, pacing back and forth, keeping an eye on the highway. They appeared to be taking the job very casually, chatting with each other rather than keeping watch. "There's nothing there," Bennett murmured to himself, then got back into the vehicle, pulling out his walkie-talkie. "There's nothing here," he said into the radio. "2 guys on the roof with 0 urgency and no power that I can spot. We're heading north around the bend. Follow closely and keep your distance from town." He smacked Cook's arm. "Keep it slow. We don't want to kick up dirt." "You got it, Cap," Cook replied, and led the convoy off-road, keeping it slow so that their footprint was minimal. It was a bumpy ride, and everyone in the vehicle was quiet, focused on the task at hand. It took a good 10 minutes of driving before they got around to the northeast part of town, still a good half-mile outside of it. There was a small neighborhood to the direct south and west of them, and nestled in the southwest corner was the high school, which was lit up like a Christmas tree. "Oh, that's definitely it," Bennett said. "Stop here." Cook stopped, and the captain got out of the vehicle, looking through the binoculars again towards the school. There were half a dozen battery-powered spotlights scattered around the building and football field, shining out in every direction with armed guards at every post. The football field was bare, covered only in lights moving back and forth across it. The field was between the soldiers and the school. Bennett continued to peer through his binoculars, taking stock of the situation. There were a couple of snipers on the roof looking their way, and most likely more facing other directions. On the ground floor, the exits had been blocked from the outside, chained up with debris in front of them. From his vantage point, he could see the side of the main entrance, which was heavily defended. Sandbags were out front, with a machine gunner's nest in the front. However, it was facing to his left, covering the main road leading up to it. "Well, this is going to be a bitch," Bennett said. He continued to look, finally spotting what he was looking for. A trio of high-end SUVs sat off to the front door, parked in a line. "Got you, you son of a bitch," he muttered, and motioned for everyone to get out and converge on him. It took a moment, but finally everyone stood together to receive their mission brief. "It looks like Rothman's convoy is parked out front," Bennett said. "We have to assume he's in there." Rice stared through his own set of binoculars, nodding his head in agreement. "I agree, that looks like his convoy," he said. "But damn, that's a fortified position if I ever saw one." "It is, and it's not going to be pretty getting in there," Bennett said. "Got 2 snipers on the roof looking our way. Every exit is barricaded, and the only door that's open is heavily guarded and has a machine gun nest in front of it." Cook straightened. "We have the shooters who can take care of the snipers, so that's not an issue," he said. "At least until they pull more our way," Huff said. "One problem at a time," Cook said. "So how the hell we getting in there?" Morgan asked. "2 teams," Bennett said, holding up 2 fingers. "The main force goes in through the front. We take out the gunner's nest and secure the entrance, with the rest of the building locked down tight. That'll trap Rothman inside." "And the second team?" Cook asked. "That's where you come in, Sergeant," Bennett said, pointing at him. "I want you to take Rice and Huff to the rear of the building and dismantle one of the barricades and get inside. While we keep them occupied at the front, you sweep the building and find that son of a bitch." "We'll take care of it," Cook said. "But what about the soldiers we encounter?" Morgan jutted out his chin. "They raise their gun to me. They're getting put down," he declared. "And that's why you're still a private," Cook snapped. Morgan sneered, but Bennett stepped in before the verbal scuffle could escalate. "Non-lethal targeting if you can, but if not, I'd rather have you walking out of there than them," the captain said firmly. Cook gave a solemn nod. He knew that Bennett was right. If it was him or the other guy, he wanted to walk away, even if it meant putting down a good man. Still, it wasn't going to be easy to do it. "Okay," Bennett said, and pointed to the 2 snipers in the group. "You 2, get your shots lined up and be ready to pull the trigger when we're ready to breach." "And after?" the first sniper asked. "You want us to move up for support?" Bennett shook his head. "Stay along the perimeter and provide cover," he instructed. "You see someone on the roof. You make sure they can't get a shot off at us." Both snipers nodded in agreement. "Everybody good?" Bennett asked. There was a chorus of "yes, sir," and he whirled a hand around his head. "Then let's get a move on," he said. "Assault begins in 10. Cook walked back over to the back of one of the vehicles, popping open the back and rummaging through the various collection of things in the back. After several moments, he pulled out a large set of bolt cutters and tossed them over to Rice. "Get the sense we're going to need these," he said. Both corporals stood there looking at him, apprehensive, as if they wanted to say something, but weren't sure how. The sergeant cocked a brow and shrugged. "Something on your mind, fellas?" he asked. "Look, we know you have beef with Morgan," Huff said. "It's just—" "We got your back," Rice said, holding up the bolt cutters. "We follow your lead in there." Cook nodded, relief he hadn't realized he'd been holding off on settling on his shoulders. "Good to know," he said. "Now come on. We're on the clock." As the 3 of them headed off, they took the long way around the perimeter so they could stay out of sight of the snipers. As they moved, Cook couldn't help the worrying thought in the back of his head. If the two men felt so uncomfortable that they felt the need to say that out loud to him, just how bad was his standing amongst the men? It was a scary thought, to be sure, especially given there were two armed killers walking directly behind him. But he had to put the thought out of his head because the task at hand was a much more pressing thought to be dealt with. Chapter 8. Cook, Rice, and Huff took cover behind a small outbuilding 100 yards from the school. They looked around the corner, spotting a lone guard making the rounds, walking by the door that they were targeting. There was a single chain with a padlock around the handles of the double doors, and a couple of oil drum-type barrels in front of it. The trio waited for the guard to wander around the side of the building before making their move. As they came out from behind cover, assault rifles at the ready, just in case, gunshots went off from the front of the building, which was quickly followed by the two shots going off at nearly the same moment from the snipers on their side. Cook rushed towards the door as the fighting in front of the building intensified, keeping an eye on the corner of the building. When they made it within 40 yards, the wandering guard came back around. "Shit!" Cook huffed and raised his weapon, firing rapidly towards the guard's legs. Despite the risk of missing, he wanted to avoid casualties if he could. Much to his surprise, one of his bullets found the soldier's leg, causing him to tumble forward as the impact yanked his legs backwards. "Get the door! I got him!" Cook barked. Rice and Huff made their way to the door to begin working on the barricade as Cook ran over to the wounded man. The soldier had dropped his weapon on the ground, struggling to reach for it when the sergeant arrived. "Easy, buddy, easy," Cook warned. "Don't make me put another round in you." The soldier gave up his pursuit of the rifle and put his hands up. Cook stepped over and kicked the rifle away, inspecting the fallen man. The bullet had hit his lower thigh with a moderate amount of blood coming out, but nothing spurting, which was a good sign. "Sidearm?" Cook asked. The wounded man nodded jerkily. "Slowly take it out and toss it aside," Cook instructed. The soldier hesitated, taking short, quick breaths. "The sooner you do it, the sooner you can stop that bleeding," the sergeant said. "Doesn't look like it hit an artery, but you're still going to bleed out unless you do something about it." The soldier winced at his words and pulled out his handgun, tossing it away from him. Cook reached down and unlatched the soldier's belt, ripping it out of the loops and tossing it onto his chest. "Tourniquet that and keep your leg elevated," Cook instructed. "I know it hurts like a son of a bitch, but it'll slow the bleeding down." The soldier took the belt with shaky hands. "If you're attacking us, why aren't you just putting me down?" he asked through his teeth. "Because I have no quarrel with you," Cook replied. "We're here for General Rothman." The soldier's brow furrowed. "Rothman?" he asked. "Why?" "He's gotten a lot of good people killed and put people like me on the run as a result," the sergeant explained. The soldier's eyes widened. "You're one of those deserters," he breathed. "Yep. We're making our own way," Cook said, "as soon as we tie off some loose ends." "Well, assuming I don't bleed out, count me in," the soldier said, voice stronger now. The sergeant eyed him curiously. "You're ready to betray your oath just like that?" he asked. "Shit, man. Half the people locked up in there didn't try to go AWOL or commit a crime," the soldier said, inclining his head towards the school. "They just questioned orders. Orders from Rothman." Cook gritted his teeth. "Let me guess, orders to kill civilians," he asked. "And worse," the soldier said. Rice gave off a distinctive clicking sound to get Cook's attention, and he glanced over to see them with the door open, ready to breach. "I gotta run," the sergeant said. "Don't suppose you know where Rothman is, do you?" "Can't say for sure," the soldier said with a shake of his head. "But our command post is on the 3rd floor, west side of the building." "Appreciate it," Cook said and nodded towards the man's wound. "Just keep that leg up." The wounded soldier gave him a thumbs up, wincing at the pain as he began threading the belt around his leg. "Have a nice chat?" Rice asked, sarcasm evident in his tone. As a matter of fact, I did, Cook snapped. He said the command post is on the 3rd floor west side of the building. Rothman is most likely there. Good a place as any to look, Huff said. Plus, if he's lying, we can come back out and pop a couple more rounds into him, Rice added. Not like he's going anywhere. Cook forced himself to ignore the murder threat and motioned for them to move. Come on, let's get inside, he said. Rice pulled the door open to let the others inside, the sergeant to the right and Huff to the left to secure the area. The gunfire from the front of the building continued to rage, pulling most of the soldiers inside in that direction. The hallway was dimly lit, with only some emergency lighting in the corners providing some light. Cook motioned for them to start moving down the hallway to their right, with him and Rice leading the way, Huff bringing up the rear and covering that direction. They made it up to the far corner, with Cook peeking out from cover. There was a long hallway that ran along the entirety of the building up to the front. There were some soldiers about 30 yards away who were in battle position, keeping their focus towards the front of the building. About 10 yards up on the outer wall stood the door for the stairwell. Cook used hand signals to let the others know of the threat down the hall, instructing them to move quietly. He led them out from cover, with Huff going a little wide to provide covering fire if they needed it. Cook and Rice hugged the wall, trying to minimize their exposure. They inched quietly up the hallway towards the stairwell door, getting halfway there before trouble arose. Cook stayed focused on the trio of soldiers down the hallway, and the bathroom door on the other side of the hallway opened up, which was quickly followed by a soldier walking out, paper towel still in his hands. Everybody froze, nobody sure of what move to make next. The soldier looked petrified, gripping the paper towel tightly as he stared at the trio of soldiers. Within a split second, it seemed as if he accepted his fate as being already dead, and did what any brave soldier would do in that moment: yell out to his friends. He barely got out an audible syllable before Huff squeezed the trigger. The bullet hit the soldier center mass, the impact sending him flying back into the bathroom, to the floor in a heap. His buddies down the hall turned towards the noise, just as Cook opened fire. He wasn't aiming to kill, rather just off the side so that the bullets impacted the wall in front of them. There was a panicked exchange of gunfire between the two groups, as they were not only startled, but scrambling for cover in the doorways. Huff darted across the hall, taking refuge in the bathroom, while Rice and Cook rushed up towards the stairwell door, managing to get inside without being hit. Cook cleared the immediate area within the stairwell, as Rice turned back and returned fire towards the trio of soldiers. He then looked back to Huff, who was doing the same. "I'll lay down suppressing fire so you can get over here," Rice suggested. Huff shook his head. "Hell no," he shot back. "You two go get Rothman. I'll hold them off and buy you time." "But there are 3 of them," Rice cried. Huff jutted out his chin. "Then they should have brought more men if they wanted a fair fight," he called back, chest puffed out. Rice chuckled and shook his head at the bravado of his friend. He turned to Cook, shutting the stairwell door behind him. "Huff?" the sergeant asked. "Going to cover us," Rice said. "Okay," Cook said with a nod. "We're moving to the 3rd floor." "Lead the way," Rice replied, raising his rifle. They made their way up the stairwell, keeping their guns at the ready. When they hit the 2nd floor landing, shots rang out from above, hitting the floor and causing them to scatter for cover. The sergeant managed to dive forward onto the next set of stairs leading up, but Rice was forced back. Another couple of shots went off towards them, allowing Cook to get a read on the shooter. He positioned himself just to the outside of the gap between the stairwell and the railings, allowing him to look up to the 3rd floor landing where the shooter was. He could see the gunman's weapon just poking out from behind the rail, but not enough to get a shot off. Cook looked back towards Rice, giving some hand signals to let him know that he had the shooter in his sights. He just needed to draw the man out. Rice nodded, taking a deep breath before moving, knowing that it was going to be risky to draw him out. Rice darted across the landing, moving very quickly, which caused the shooter from above to lean forward to get his shot, exposing his front hand on the gun. Without hesitation, Cook squeezed the trigger, sending a bullet directly into the shooter's hand, shredding it. The sergeant popped up and sprinted towards the top of the stairs, making it within sight of the next landing, seeing the soldier gripping his wounded hand tightly to try and stop the bleeding. Rice joined him, keeping his weapon on the soldier as Cook kicked his weapons away. "Take your belt off," the sergeant demanded. The soldier hesitated, seething as he held his hand and stared with wide eyes at his attackers. "Do it now, or he's going to put one in your head," Cook snapped. The soldier complied, unbuckling his belt with his good hand, fumbling a little but managing to pull it free and hand it over. "Roll over," Cook said. "Now." The soldier groaned as he rolled over, instinctively putting his hands behind his back. The sergeant used the belt as a makeshift restraint, pulling it as tightly as he could on the soldier's wrists. This also helped in slowing the blood flow to his hand at least. "Where is General Rothman?" Cook asked. The soldier muttered under his breath, and the sergeant grabbed him by the hair, jerking his head back and speaking into his ear, voice menacing. "I'm not going to ask again," he said. "Where is General Rothman?" "Command center," the man stammered, louder. "Go left out of here, and it's at the end of the hallway." "How many men does he have?" Cook asked. "Half dozen or so," the soldier huffed. "Plus 3 of ours." Cook glanced back at Rice, as if to ask his opinion on the matter. The other man shrugged. "Seems like a waste of time if we came all this way and didn't make a play for him," he drawled. Cook leaned back down to the wounded soldier. "Here's the deal," he said in a low voice. "We're not here for you, so if you stay here while we take care of this, we'll get someone to patch you up, and you can keep on living. You good with that deal?" The wounded man nodded, and Cook gave him a smack on the shoulder. "Attaboy," he said, and stood up, turning to Rice. "Come on, let's get this done." The duo opened the door to the 3rd floor, glancing down both directions in the hallway. They saw a couple of guards outside the door of the command center about 50 yards away. The hallway was dark like the 1st floor, with a small number of emergency lights illuminating things. Despite the darkness, Cook could see that all the doors close to him were shut. He looked back to Rice, keeping his voice at a whisper. "Stay here," he said softly. Rice nodded as Cook moved into the hallway, using the darkness to get over to the closest door. He gently tried the knob. Finding it locked, he moved back across and back into the stairwell to formulate a plan. "Door's locked," he said quietly, "so we have to assume there's no cover between here and there." Rice pursed his lips. "So as soon as we start shit." "We're sitting ducks," the sergeant finished. "Don't suppose you have any bright ideas, Sarge," Rice said. "Bright ideas?" Cook asked. "No, good ideas," he paused. "Still, no." "Reckless ideas?" Rice asked. The sergeant sighed. "Oh, I got one of them brewing," he said. "Just don't get me killed," the other man quipped. "No promises, no promises," Cook quipped. "But don't worry, I'm going to be doing the stupid stuff." Rice cocked his head. "What you got in mind?" he asked. "I'm going to flank them," Cook said. His companion blinked in confusion. "Come again," he asked. "The school is a big square," the sergeant explained. "So I'm going to go the other way, haul ass around it, and lay down some fire from the other side. That should draw some of them out, and you can cut them down." Rice took a deep breath. "That's risky," he said. "Not as risky as taking them on from one door," Cook argued, "especially since they could do the same thing to us that we're going to do to them." Rice took a moment to think about it before finally giving a nod and raising his rifle. "Okay, let's do it," he said. "Here goes nothing," Cook replied, and exited the stairwell silently, making the turn away from the command center. Even 3 floors up and 50 yards away from the front of the building, he could still hear the battle raging outside. "Hope you're getting the upper hand, Cap," he thought. He made it to the corner near the light, but before entering to make the turn for the back hallway, he paused and peered back towards the command center guards. They were still looking straight ahead, not paying any attention to either side. Cook made a break for it, quickly making it around the corner, gun raised just in case of company. Once around, he didn't wait to see if the guards had noticed him. As soon as he recognized that the hallway was vacant, he broke into a dead sprint. He only slowed down at the next corner, peering around just in time to spot a soldier making rounds. Walking in his direction, he ducked back behind cover, readying the butt of his rifle for the unsuspecting guard. As soon as the wandering guard came around the corner, Cook leapt into action, connecting the back of the gun to the side of the man's head. He dropped in a heap in the corner, knocked completely out cold. The sergeant patted the man down, pulling out his sidearm and rifle, but didn't find anything to secure him with. He knew he should do something in case he woke up, but he wasn't willing to kill an unconscious man. He let out a huff, hoping that he could complete the mission before the soldier regained the ability to be a threat. Cook moved down the hallway quickly, gun at the ready in case of more wandering soldiers. Luckily, he didn't encounter any as he arrived at the final corner. He peered around the edge, barely getting an eyelash past the corner so he could conceal his presence. Both guards still stood in the exact same spot at the door, totally unaware. Inside the command center, he could see half a dozen men standing around a table, having a discussion over a map. They looked unconcerned with the battle raging outside, apparently confident that their men could handle the situation. He looked closer, and even though it was a good 60 yards or so away, there was enough light in the room for him to identify Rothman. "Got you," he thought, hunger rising in him for the retribution he so desperately craved. He took a moment to steady himself, knowing that things were about to get intense. Finally, he popped out from cover, aiming his gun towards the command center, pointing at the soldier to the left and squeezing the trigger. The bullet found its target, striking the man in the gut and dropping him to the ground. This not only startled his partner, who raised his gun and opened fire while taking cover behind the wall on the next hallway, but also the men inside the command center. Cook ducked back behind cover as bullets flew in his direction, not just from the guard, but from several men inside the command center, which shattered the glass wall of the room. The sergeant popped out, returning fire, seeing that one of the guards had shoved General Rothman into a small closet, while the rest of the soldiers flipped over tables and took cover. There was an intense exchange of gunfire coming from the room, forcing Cook to continue to stay behind the wall. He tried to lean around the edge to fire off another shot, but only got one off before an overwhelming amount of bullets came his way. As he waited for the gunfire to die down, he glanced back towards the soldier he knocked out, seeing that he was still down and not moving. At least one thing's going right, he thought. Finally, the gunshots died down, so he peeked around the corner, spotting 3 of the soldiers inside the command center, inching forward carefully, ready to strike if Cook went even a millimeter further out. He stayed motionless, watching as they got to the edge of the room, stepping on broken glass. "Okay, Rice, it's your time to shine," he urged mentally, waiting with anticipation. If Rice didn't come through, Cook knew he was fucked. A moment later, the relative silence in the hallway was broken as a hail of bullets shredded the soldiers from the side as they stepped out of the command center. 2 of them dropped immediately, while one managed to duck back into the room and take position to return fire. Cook didn't waste the opening, immediately coming out from behind cover and firing at the retreating man. The soldier didn't stand a chance, getting cut down from the side by Cook and dropping him. The scene fell silent, with the only remaining people inside the command center being General Rothman and the guard that shoved him into a closet. The sergeant reached the outer wall of the hallway, the same side of the wall that the closet was on, and moved up it quickly. He constantly scanned the room, making sure there wasn't anybody else hiding. When he got closer, he spotted a hand on the floor coming out from behind an overturned table, a victim of one of his spray and pray bullet sprees. He grew closer and closer to the command center, or what was left of it, and startled when Rice fired one more shot into the body of one of the soldiers barely moving on the ground. The duo made eye contact and nodded. Cook made some hand gestures, letting him know that Rothman was in the closet with another guard. Rice returned the gestures, responding that he would cover the approach. The sergeant made it to the edge of the room, standing on a pile of broken glass and aiming his gun towards the closet door. "General Rothman," he barked. "You still with us in there?" "Who is that?" Rothman called from behind the door. "Your voice is familiar." "Sergeant Cook," Cook replied. "Oh yes, one of Captain Bennett's men," the general drawled. "I assume this is his doing?" "You would assume correctly," Cook called back. "So, what's your big plan here, Sergeant?" Rothman asked, his voice smug as hell. "You think you're going to come in here, take me out, and that would be that?" Cook rolled his eyes. "Something like that," he said. "Not the smartest of plans," the general mocked. "Well, you're trapped in a closet with a bunch of gunmen outside." Cook shot back. "Seems like it's working pretty well so far. So why don't you come out and we'll put a bow on this puppy?" "Normally, I'd insult your lineage," Rothman said, and Cook could see the sneer on his face and tell you where you can go. "But I'll take the high ground here, if for no other reason than to see you and Bennett kneeling in front of me as I execute you myself for treason." Cook sighed. "Yeah, whatever gets you out of that closet," he said dismissively. "Both of you come out now, hands up and empty and slow. Do it now." The closet door opened slowly, and a soldier stepped out, his hands empty and high above his head. Rothman emerged from behind him, his hands up as well, but looking smug as ever, like he didn't have a care in the world. Cook hit his communicator. "Target acquired," he said simply, and the bullets outside died down considerably into a few rogue shots before falling completely silent. The sergeant and the general locked eyes, and Cook grinned at him before walking up and taking his sidearm, tossing it aside. "I'm gonna want that back," Rothman commanded. "I'm sure you will," Cook snapped, and then into his communicator, "Target secure," coming out from the third floor. He stepped behind Rothman, putting his gun into his back and shoving him forward. "Let's get a move on," he instructed. "Captain Bennett is going to want a word with you." Chapter 9. Cook and Rice led General Rothman out of the front door, his guard right beside him. As they exited the building, they could see that one hell of a battle had taken place. There were a few dead soldiers on the ground, and a few more off to the side who were receiving medical treatment. Some were from the strike team, and some were the guards, all being treated the same. Captain Bennett sat atop some sandbags, right beside the machine gun, a giant smile on his face at the sight of the general. He hopped down from the nest with a spring in his step and approached. "General Rothman, so good to see you again," he drawled. Rothman sneered. "You won't be saying that when you're at the business end of my pistol," he snapped. Bennett smirked, shaking his head. "That would be a fun trick," he said, and without any warning punched the general in the gut so hard he dropped to one knee. "But one you'll have to reserve for your next life." Rothman spit on Bennett's boots, but the captain just laughed and stepped to the side, rubbing it off on the general's leg. He yanked Rothman up by the back of the neck and put a gun into his back before marching him around the area, speaking in a loud voice to all the men watching. "This man, no, this sorry excuse for a man is the reason we're here tonight," Bennett bellowed. "How many of you fought at Kansas City?" All around the group, his own men and the ones he'd been fighting against, a smattering of hands rose into the air. "This is the man responsible for your pain," Bennett declared. "This is the man responsible for your friends who are no longer above ground. His idiocy His arrogance, his complete lack of caring destroyed so many lives, soldier and civilian alike, and that was just at Kansas City. He continued parading the general around, locking eyes with soldiers as he went, watching with satisfaction as anger built in them. When the pullback from the South happened, Rothman was in charge of that, he continued. In our last encounter, he not only left behind dozens of injured soldiers, but ordered them to be put down like dogs, rather than spend the resources to move them to safety. This asshole, who was supposed to take care of us on the front lines risking it all, was ordering the deaths of our brothers and sisters in arms. Angry murmurs rippled through the crowd, and as Bennett passed Cook, the sergeant took the opportunity to murmur into his ear. Bennett quivered, clenching his jaw, and continued his parade with fresh information. "And the soldiers that you're here guarding," he added, "soldiers that you've been told are criminals who are abandoning their duty. Do you know why they're here?" He waited a beat for effect, then continued, "Because they questioned this asshole's orders. Didn't disobey, didn't run away, just questioned why we were leaving people behind. He had them arrested and thrown in here. And according to my information, he was here to pile them into trucks and ship them to the front lines, which we all know is a death sentence for prisoners." He raised his chin. "Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but I didn't sign up to die for one man's ego. Did you?" There was a chorus of no through the crowd, mostly his own men, but some of the others joined in. "I didn't think so," Bennett barked. "Now I want every man inside this building freed from captivity and taken to the gymnasium. Do it now if you're physically able to walk. All I ask is that afterwards, you listen to what I have to say. If you don't like it, you're free to go." There were nods all around, and soldiers got up, walking away to follow their orders. As they dispersed, Morgan approached with a man in tow. Cook recognized him as the guard that had shoved Rothman in the closet. "Captain, I think you're going to want to hear what this man has to say," Morgan said. Bennett shoved Rothman down to his knees and turned to greet the man. "What's your name?" he asked. "Corporal Bonds, sir," the guard replied. "What's on your mind, Corporal?" Bennett asked. Bonds took a deep breath. "I just got assigned to General Rothman yesterday," he admitted, "and I had no idea what he had done. If you'll give me the opportunity, I'd like to prove my worth." The captain shrugged. "Don't really have anything you can do to prove your worth at the moment," he said. "There's 20 other soldiers in this town," Bonds insisted. "I can radio them, deliver the order that everybody report here, and convince them to hear you out." Bennett pursed his lips in thought. "We can listen in, and if he tips them off, he gets a bullet," Morgan suggested. "That sound fair to you, Corporal?" "If that's the price to prove my worth, so be it," Bonds said firmly. Bennett waved a hand. "Get the man a radio," he said. "Then get inside and help them get the prisoners to the gym." "Yes, sir," Morgan said, and walked off with the corporal in tow. Bennett turned to Cook, giving him a nod. "Good work in there, Sergeant," he said. "Just doing my part to bring this asshole to justice," Cook said. Rothman let out a wistful sigh. "It's going to be so gratifying to pull the lever on your hanging," he said. Cook smacked the back of his head. "Shut the fuck up," he snapped. Bennett cocked a brow. "I don't approve of abusing prisoners, Sergeant," he drawled. "However, I will make an exception this time." "Appreciate that, Captain," Cook replied. Bennett inclined his head. "Come on, let's get inside," he said. "Things are about to get interesting." Chapter 10. The gymnasium was crowded with nearly 200 soldiers, most of whom were ex-prisoners in the school. They were a cross-section of America, all races, ages, and both male and female. Bennett, Cook, and Rothman stood just outside, looking in at the crowd. "Jesus," Bennett breathed. "How many people were you willing to kill to satisfy your power?" The general raised his chin. "If you're going to be a leader, Captain, and I mean a true leader, nobody can question you or your orders," he declared. "Nobody. You remember that if you ever get into the position I am in." Cook scoffed. "You ready, Cap?" he asked. "Let's do it," Bennett replied. The three of them walked into the gym, right into the center of the court. The soldiers fell silent immediately, all eyes focused on the scene in front of them. "Good evening, everyone," Bennett greeted politely. "My name is Captain Bennett. Now, I have a question for you all. How many of you are in here because of General Rothman?" The entire congregation raised their hands. He couldn't see people's faces because there were so many arms in the air. "How many of you simply questioned his orders?" Bennett asked. Maybe about 30% of the soldiers lowered their hands, leaving a large force behind. "And how many of you are fed up with a system that would promote and protect a sociopath like this while being so eager to throw you under the bus?" Bennett asked, voice rising. Every single hand shot up, and the captain bathed in it, smiling. He stood there for a moment looking over at the general, who was finally starting to look properly concerned. The general turned his gaze on Bennett, eyes pleading. "Wish I could say it's been fun, Rothman," Bennett said, and drew his handgun, firing a single bullet into the general's gut, dropping him to the ground. There were a few gasps in the audience, but nobody objected. Bennett stared down at the general as he writhed in pain, bleeding out on the basketball court. He knelt down and whispered, "Now, let me show you what a real leader looks like." He stood up, spreading his arms, slowly walking back and forth in front of the crowd. "As of right now, in the eyes of the U.S. military, we are all fugitives," he began. "Soldiers who violated orders. Soldiers who ran away from the fight. To them, we're vermin, who if caught will be sent to the front lines without adequate supplies to take out as many of those things as we can until we're overwhelmed." He raised a fist. "Well, I say, to hell with that." He stepped closer, walking back and forth some more, but looking each soldier in the eye as he passed, watching them accept his words, their gazes soaking up every one of his words. A few dozen of us have already secured several towns in the south of the state, secured food supplies, water supplies, and the manpower to keep them flowing long term. But with you, with each and every one of you working with us, we can do so much more. We can forge our own path, create our own society, rule this state like royalty, and there's not a damn thing anybody can do to stop us." Cheers broke out, the crowd screaming and throwing their fists into the air, and he let them do so, letting their excitement and hunger wash over him. Finally, he raised his hands to settle the noise. "Now, this will not be easy," he warned. "The people in this state are proud and won't take us ruling over them lightly. Sacrifices will need to be made, but it will benefit us all in the long term." He held up a finger. "Make no mistake, we are in a new era, a new reality. But we will have to fight for this. Forget the everyday people who will object to our presence. Our former brothers and sisters in the military may come knocking on our doors one day, and we may have to take up arms against them." He smacked his chest with a fist. "But in my heart of hearts, I know that once word spreads about us, more will rally to our cause rather than throw their lives away for the likes of Rothman here." He gave the general a kick in the kidneys as he passed, causing the man to groan louder as he continued to cradle his mangled belly on the floor. "Now, I know this fight may not be for everyone," Bennett continued his slow walk, tone softening. "And that's fine. If you want to leave, if you want to rejoin the military and follow them into the battle that is happening God only knows where, the door is there. Please go." He stopped walking, squaring his shoulders and raising his chin. "But if you stay, you fall in line under me. Decide now." He stood there, looking over the crowd, very few of them whispering to each other, the rest nodding and staring at him. He let them have the space and time, confident they would understand. After a few moments, nobody got up to leave. Bennett grinned. "Okay, then it's time to get to work," he declared. First order of business is to cover our tracks here. Because if the military thinks the prison camp has been emptied, they will send people after us, and that's something we don't need. For this, I need 30 volunteers who don't mind getting their hands dirty. Within moments, a flood of soldiers, male and female, came down from the bleachers, standing in front of the captain. Bennett nodded at the lineup. Stories of General Rothman being cruel to civilians has certainly spread throughout the state amongst civilians and soldiers alike, he said. So we need to make it look like there was a civilian uprising against this facility. With any luck, maybe the military will think someone spotted him and took the opportunity to get revenge for one of the many crimes he's committed against the population. Morgan raised his hand. "We can certainly burn this building to the ground, Captain," he said. Bennett shook his head. "If only it were that easy," he said. "In order for this to work, there needs to be no civilian witnesses." Morgan smirked, nodding in agreement. "Understood, Captain," he said, voice sickly sweet. Cook swallowed hard, a disgusted and worried look on his face that he couldn't wipe away. But he knew he couldn't speak up. It would be simple for any one of them to put a bullet in him and add him to the pile. "Get it done," Bennett said, and as Morgan rallied his group, the captain turned and put his arm around the sergeant's shoulders, leading him away. "I know you're horrified, Sergeant," he said quietly, "which is why I don't need you here for this." Cook stopped short, eyebrows rising. "Captain," he asked. "Look, I'm not blind to the fact that you care for the civilians," Bennett said, raising a hand. "It's a good quality to have, especially in the coming weeks and months once we are setting up our communities. But right now, bad things need to happen. I know you don't believe it, but they are necessary." Cook swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "Captain," he stammered, tone defeated. "I know," Bennett assured him gently. "I want you to head back to Burlington and begin setting up your post there. That's an order." The sergeant was stunned, unsure of what to do. All he could manage was a half-hearted "yes, sir," before shuffling out the door. He found an unoccupied vehicle, getting inside and starting it up. He drove a few blocks before slamming on the brakes, his heart rate rising, breathing increased. He opened his mouth and let out a primal scream, letting all the anguish and frustration expel from his lungs. This wasn't what he signed up for. He wanted to protect those who had been wrongly accused of desertion, not condemn an entire town of survivors to death. He punched the steering wheel several times, but the screaming nor the violence really released the emotions warring inside of him. He took a deep breath and saw movement to his right. He turned and spotted an older woman peering out at him from behind a curtain. When their eyes met, she quickly closed it again. "Just start the car and go," he murmured to himself. "Just start the car and go." He closed his eyes, resting his forehead on the steering wheel. You can't do anything to stop it, and you can't do any good if you're lying dead in the streets. He reluctantly started the car again, peeling his face from the steering wheel and punching the gas, speeding out of town before he could convince himself otherwise. A few miles away, he glanced in the rearview mirror at a bright red blaze coming from town. No doubt the school being set ablaze. Cook had already had doubts about Bennett and the mission, but this night had just sealed it. The only thing now was, what could he possibly do about it? The end.